We worked for Procter & Gamble for several decades. I think it was 30 years. One day, the president of the company said, "We have bad news. Children hate soap because the mothers wash their faces with soap. The soap gets into their eyes and they detest it. And obviously, if they detest it as children, they'll detest soap when they grow up. What can you do about that?" We always make a research, and we found that an artist called Brenda Putnam sculpted in soap instead of wax. It was less expensive, easier to handle, no waste, because whatever the waste in sculpting was could be used for cleaning purposes. We then went to psychologists to find out whether children had a creative instinct or creative feeling from the age of 4 to 5 up. The psychologists concurred in that. We then suggested to the company that we have soap sculpture competitions each year based on the various categories of ages that the psychologists said were the ages at which children did more or less the same type of creative activity. Within a year's time, 23 million children in the public schools were sculpting in ivory soap and loving it as not only a creative medium, but also as a medium for cleanliness, which ivory soap said is next to godliness, because it was 99 and 44% pure. The competition kept up for 15 years, and it made such an impact that today the competition has been over for, I'd say 40 years, and many of the schools that had it as a competition are now having it as part of the curriculum, and ivory soap and Procter & Gamble are still profiting from it, and so is the society, because cleanliness is indeed next to godliness.
We continue now with Edward Bernays, and I've got a little bit of fun there for you for visuals. A huge epic 80s and 90s commercial collection, and how appropriate for Edward Bernays, because as we shall see, this is all about advertising. And I won't reread the quote from chapter 1 that I read in the introduction yesterday, because it's pretty obvious that it begins with the positing of a secret elite. And what Bernays means, of course, is the managerial society that we saw in so many of these technocrats, in Quigley, in Russell, etc. And that they will use all of these methods and means, right? Hollywood, the theater, media, literature, to promote various ideas and various aspects of propaganda. And it goes back to the war period, World War I, World War II, and then into the Cold War. A lot of these periods were actually experimentations in different types of social arrangements and propaganda. If we recall, that was in Russell's chapter when it came to the Axis powers, and when it came to the Bolsheviks and Russia, that those were experimentations, social experiments, he called them. And so Bernays is similar in that regard, in that he is not the same level of mathematician and planner as a Bertrand Russell, but he's focused on one arena of, as we called it, full spectrum manipulation or full spectrum propaganda. Bernays is focused specifically on propaganda, like I said, I think he's comparable maybe to a next phase H.G. Wells, although obviously Bernays was not writing science fiction. So he talks about ads, and he talks about the wise men. This is, of course, one of those Council on Foreign Relation type titles for the high level people like John J. McCloy or a Kissinger or Brzezinski, the so-called wise men, CIA, James Jesus Angleton, these kinds of characters, Howard Hunt, big scale planners working at the behest, in our case, of the big corporatists, Rockefellers, industrialists, Carnegies, right, all the, and the bankers. And as we said, Bernays begins with H.G. Wells' quote about the modern communications basically changing the world. And boy, have we seen that with the internet, right? I mean, obviously the internet has completely changed the game when it comes to the transmission of information. You know, print is dying out, legacy media dying out, and we're going through this period of transitions. Then he begins to discuss groups. Now, again, this was written in the 20s, 1928 by Bernays. And so I'm guessing that social affiliation groups were a lot more important at that time. They still have some role. People go into fraternities, secret societies, college frats, sororities. They're members of the Delphian Club, the Book Club, the Library Club, the Students Club, blah, blah, blah. There's still some aspect of that, but actually I think those kinds of groupings tend to be breaking down part and parcel with the loss of social cohesion as a whole, largely as a result of things like the internet and so forth. I think that's a big part of why we're losing social cohesion, is maybe not so much the internet itself, but things like Facebook. And this is what the Facebook executives themselves, two of them now have come out, former execs, saying, sorry, we accidentally ripped apart society. Now, Bernays is interesting because, and again, this is still true to a degree, but not as much as it used to be. Groups, frats, the League to Abolish Capital Punishment, the American Institute of Accountants, the Rosicrucian Order, the American Academy in Rome, the American Antiquarian Society. He says, if you just look at the list of groups in the annual directory in 1928, there were 22,000 groups publishing periodicals in America. And all of these groups, he says, had different needs or usages for propaganda. And universities, as an extension, then also are going to need to use propaganda, sales, and marketing in the new phase he's talking about, in the coming world of his day, in the late 20s. This is going to be important. Different businesses, different corporations, different government institutions, he's saying, will have to adopt these techniques, or else they're not going to survive. Thousands of women, he says, may unconsciously belong to a sorority which follows the fashions set by a single society leader. So you have the idea of, you don't really have to control all these groups. All you have to do is to control the leaders of these groups, because the leaders can turn and switch and steer their respective groups in different directions. So the control mechanism of our society isn't complete control over every single person. It's complete control over the major groupings and areas of society, right? The most important men in banking, the most important men in education, the most important men in literature, the most important men in blah, 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 right? That's how the control mechanism operates, and generally speaking, it's done through money. He says these thousands of groups, you must remember, interlock. So this invisible intertwining structure of groups and associations is the mechanism upon which our giant democracy, quote unquote, is based. Of course, we do not live in a real democracy. Now, I'm not a proponent of democracy, quote unquote. Democracy is actually the worst form of government, because it is actually run by invisible oligarchs. So here is a man who claims to be a Democrat, one of these fake leftists like Bertrand Russell, telling you that we don't actually live in a democracy. Democracy is actually a covert form of government run by oligarchs. That's what Plato said a long time ago. And of course, what do we have with all these characters? Ethics is just simply an evolving thing. That's how he ends this first section. The new propaganda, he says, is the power has been taken away from kings and it's now been given to the people. But rather than it really being in the hands of the people, it didn't go to kings to people. It actually went from kings to the bourgeoisie. Yep. Went from kings to an aristocracy of money. So that's who really runs things in our world. And he goes on to say, in a way, this is, I'm going to be dealing with, in my book, with Metropolis, the Fritz Lang film. And when you watch that film, there's actually some pretty poignant, powerful, prophetic symbolism and imagery in that movie. It's pretty kind of mind-blowing, actually, how deep that really was. He goes on to say propaganda is really the main executive power arm of the invisible secret government that runs things. And yeah, that's true. Advertising, he says, the majority of the American public gets its ideas from advertising and fashion. This is the mechanism by which most people on a large scale are disseminated ideas. That's why memes are now kind of the new version of this. So in a way, Bernays, I guess you could say, pioneered the notion of memes on the internet, just in the way that he talks about advertising, and that advertising is a big part of how you control people's thought processes. And this is actually overlooked, as I said, in, quote, conspiracy alt media circles. People overlook the power of advertising as probably just as powerful or important a driver of opinions and transfer of money and commodities than even something like movies. I would say advertising is probably as powerful as film and Hollywood and music, and really film, Hollywood, music can be viewed as just a form of advertising anyway. All right, I mean, like Fast and Furious 1, does it really differ from Fast and Furious Part 17? No. So Fast and Furious 1 is in a way like an ad for Fast and Furious Part 2, Part 3, Part 4, right? They're just ads for the next one. And then he goes on to talk about fake news, and that this is page 51. Fake news can actually be put into play at the behest of the State Department, at this behest of foundations like the Carnegie Foundation, is who he was behind some of these stories that he mentions. So, in other words, they were already in the 20s, essentially controlling mass media, using PR firms to put out fake stories to influence opinion. And this was, of course, covered in Tragedy and Hope as well, where Quigley makes that same point about the large-scale control of most of the newspapers and media publications in the West were already back in the 20s. He says he says the New York Times, for example, was already under that control back in the 20s. So, another good example of propaganda. I was trying to read my notes here, and I thought it said Kong. I was thinking the King Kong movie. How was that? I guess in a way that could be propaganda. But no, actually, my note says Coney 2012. That's a great example of failed propaganda. That one actually didn't do very well. It ended up just kind of collapsing on itself because the idiot that they put into control of that propaganda outfit more or less lost his mind. That Jason, whatever his name was, guy. But what he defines propaganda is, modern propaganda at least, is a consistent, enduring effort to create or shape events to influence the relations of the public to some enterprise, idea, or group. So it has multiple functions here. Again, just think back to Coney 2012 and how that was a kind of State Department, CIA-backed, Pentagon-backed propaganda campaign targeted at evangelicals and college students to get them involved in this ridiculous front venture for AFRICOM, probably to funnel a lot of money too from idiots and evangelical churches into some venture for the securing of mineral deposits and rights. That's really what AFRICOM does. Of course, the evangelicals will never figure that out, And that's why I was actually tearing down all the Coney 2012 posters when on my campus and throwing them in the trash can. He mentions Walter Lippmann, as we said, mentions him by name, so we know that he is drawing directly from the OSS-CIA wartime guys, and that's what he actually says on the next page. You can achieve a lot more through a wartime period, through the success of propaganda, than you can in so-called peacetime. We know that from many other writings that we saw in Quigley, and other globalists have said the same thing basically. And again, he says that really the key to running things is to secure the cooperation of the key men in these groups. And this is what we saw with this MI6 strategy of how they control political parties, or how you steer elections. This is really how the global system establishes, stays in power, is that it buys off the leaders of emerging trends, groups, movements, etc. You don't have to own everybody, control everybody in the political party in Greece or wherever, or Africa, or you just have to get the head dude on board to steer things. And if he goes down, so if people get on to him as a crook, and the people say have a coup and get rid of him, well, you just get the next guy. He goes into some examples, as we saw you saw a few minutes ago in the videos. He mentions some stuff that was hard to sell, that they did experiments to see if they could sell it. And then he mentions here velvet, and then he says, well, how do we sell velvet if we wanted to try to convince everybody that you need to go back to velvet? And he says, dress it up in like Paris elite fashion. And he says, get a pop star to wear it. This is back in the 20s. They were doing this. This is not. So in other words, when you see Kim Kardashian, the way this works is I don't know, I have no idea. Like Coco Chanel will say, hey Kim, we're going to give you a bunch of thousands of dollars free product. Maybe we'll even on the down low pay you $100,000 if you tweet and talk about on your show and wear Coco Chanel perfume or all that stuff, right? So then Kim Kardashian does that, and all the herd-like females out there say, oh, I want to be like Kim Kardashian because she's an it girl, and I also, right, it's this fallacy of association. Oh, I use Coco Chanel perfume like Kim Kardashian does, right? Now it sounds stupid when you actually logically think it through, but that's how this stuff works. It's not based on logic. It's based on, as Bernays will say, reactive emotive impulses, right? Control of the id. That's why sex in advertising is so useful, based on the Freudian principles, which he will go into in a minute. He says the president is an important office, not so much because he necessarily has all this power, but the power of the presidency is in his vocal, visible position of influence. So he is an influencer because he has the gaze of most of the population. So don't misunderstand. We talk often about, the presidents are puppets. Well, they are puppets in the sense of they're beholden to the money behind them. But you also have to keep in mind that is also, just having a position of tremendous visibility and influence and media attention, that in itself is a lot of power. So it's incorrect to say, the president has no power whatsoever. But he says that, actually what happens is these big foundations, NGOs and so forth, Bernays argues that as we saw in the examples at the beginning of the second hour here, most of those trends can be concocted. And this is actually what we see exemplified in the goofy, is it a rom-com? No, it's more just a silly comedy, Josie and the Pussycats. Everybody should watch Josie and the Pussycats. I always recommend this, and people are incredulous. They're like, why would you recommend a stupid movie? Actually, watch that movie. You will see the very process of what Bernays is talking about. Again, you want a practical comedic example of Edward Bernays and propaganda, watch the 2001 or 2 Josie and the Pussycats. It has, what's her name? Rachel Lee Cook and that black girl, I forget her name. Anyway, definitely a movie you can learn from. And you find out that, at the end of the film, I won't spoil it, but basically you can already deduce that the trends are created. And they're a band, by the way. And I never watched that movie because I thought it was just like a silly girl comedy, which it kind of is, but it's not just for females. It's actually, it actually is making a very interesting point. Kind of like the Charlie's Angels, the recent ones. They're kind of goofy. The ones with Lucy Liu and Cameron Diaz and Sam Rockwell. But they actually kind of make, if I recall, they make a point where the bad guy is using frequencies or something, like a plot similar to Kingsman, I think is what it was, if I recall. It was something like that. But even more illustrative, as we said, is Josie and the Pussycats. Definitely watch that for fun in tandem with, I might even include that in my new book, actually. Watch that in tandem with this talk. Then he talks about the importance of the creation of PR, public relations firms, and that all areas of life and government and corporations are now going to need PR, and the means by which, again, the public's perceptions are swayed is through word of mouth, through letters, through the stage, through movies, radio, lectures, magazines, newspapers, and education. Surveys, at this time, surveys, I guess, played a more important role. I suppose they still do, but actually, surveys can be rigged and made up and faked very easily to actually persuade people, right? Oh, most Americans believe XYZ, therefore you should also believe XYZ. And so Bernays is back in the 20s saying, oh, don't overlook the power of surveys. Don't overlook the power of rumors, right? Fake rumors can be spread, he says, and can cause the loss of millions in stocks. You could spread a false rumor about some stock and it caused it to tank, and none of it was true. So Bernays is, again, talking about these different techniques and tactics, which actually just is a kind of a form of demoralization. So here's another example where psychological warfare would be very similar to the tactic of advertising, where, like in psychological warfare, you might want to erode the people's faith in some leader or some organization or movement or nation, just in classical psyops. So, what do? Well, let's spread a rumor amongst that population that's, be it whatever. Right? If they're really superstitious, alien vampire chupacabras are running your government, right? That would be just a goofy example, which might work. The CIA has done that kind of stuff with vampires and stuff. False rumors with superstitious people about vampires. Or you might say, the present leader of your company is, the rumor gets spread that, he's actually siphoning off money laundering through the company. Or the hamburgers they serve there are made out of human meat. Right, Soylent Green or something. I mean, I'm just giving examples of how, and then this rumor spreads, and, for the sake of argument, it's not true, but it actually damages that company. So these kinds of things actually happen all the time, right? So I'm not saying that hamburgers and McDonald's are good. I'm just giving examples here. And he goes on to talk about the group mind, right? This is the group mind is what we're manipulating here. And understanding mass psychology is the control of the group mind. And he says, for example, even then, women are making more and more final monetary decisions about purchasing. Women are making the purchases, page 72. So even then, you have the rise of feminism. And of course, Bernays knew about feminism, and he talked about feminism, and he mentions it as a technique, a trick, and they manipulate it through, right, freedom torches. If you're a feminist woman, you smoke a freedom torch to show you're liberated, right? And that was at the behest of tobacco companies, right, to get a whole other side of the population smoking cigarettes. Stocks, again, he just gives example. Impulse buying. He says impulse buying is a big thing to understand. That a lot of people don't actually think through their process of what they purchase. They just buy. Right. This is why people don't save, and why they live check to check quite often, is because they don't have any they tend not to have a self-control mechanism by which they can avoid impulse buying. And he says that this can be exploited by large-scale interests by reactive emotional impulse purchases, right? So the beer commercial with, you crack open the beer and suddenly you're surrounded by a bevy, your own harem of bikini babes. Right? This is like the most obvious example of this. Well, obviously that's not true, but if you've had a couple beers in the bar and this commercial comes on, it's late at night, maybe there's one or two hot girls in this sausage fest bar with 50 dudes in there. You see, and so you're thinking, you know what the heck? I'm going to crack open another 3 or 4 Budweisers because I'm going to get those chicks over there. This is, in other words, this is what actually happens. This is how, this is the thought process of the, not the rational mind, but the emotional impulse buy. He says, the herd follows cliches. They don't follow actually thought out logical principles. They generically associate things with just terms and ideas. And because of that, it can all be easily manipulated, especially through things like Freudian sex principles and unconscious desires. So again, just put bikini babes with Budweiser and the nerdy dude cracks it open and suddenly, there's 20 girls jumping on top of it. Total divorce from reality, but it works. It's just ridiculous. It's kind of like, always makes me think of that old Saturday Night Live skit with Adam Sandler and Chris Farley, Schmidt's Gay, where it's they crack open the beer in the commercial, but it's a gay beer, so it brings all these dudes. Anyway, it's funny. It's good, but it's kind of a takeoff on the absurdity of the bikini babes Budweiser commercials. So you control doctors, for example, to increase food profits because, quote, doctors can decide what the healthy diet is. And this is why the healthy diet has changed so many times. It's not because doctors are actually making new discoveries, but because a lot of money is going into doctors saying the right thing to sell products. Now, you might not think of it, but even home design can be subject to propaganda. In other words, there might be for example, selling men on the idea of the man cave, right? You need the man cave. Maybe years ago it was, you need the bar in your house, the martini bars, so that you can service the guests who come over for poker night back in the 50s or something. Now it's, you need your man cave so that you can watch sports, right? Worship at the idol of sports. All that has been sold to people, right? They've been convinced of this and sold this idea through propaganda and the altering of the design of homes even. The idea of a home theater, right? This was another alteration of homes based on marketing and propaganda. Bernays says you have to sell the need, right? Sell people on why they need this thing. You don't sell the product, you sell the need. This can be done through a lot of ways. Creating a buzz through big events. Event planning, right? What's event planning all about? Selling crap. You heard the ivory soap examples that he gave. They created this huge nationwide contest about sculpting. What a bunch of goofballs wasting time sculpting, hours and hours put into sculpting soap. And what do you win? Probably a decoder ring and free soap bars or something. But it worked to sell a bunch of bars of ivory soap. And Bernays outlines on page 82 that what's the principle behind all this? Enlightened self-interest, right? People are just going to buy whatever they perceive to be in their self-interest. So what you got to do is just sell them on why this is in their self-interest. And this ultimately becomes the Rand Corporation's game theory model. Now, Bernays doesn't mention Rand Corporation. He's pre-Rand Corporation, but I'm saying that model on page 82 of enlightened self-interest becomes the philosophy of Rand Corporation. Advertising, again, is the tool and technique of big business, and big business is injected now into all of our lives. You didn't ask to have big business injected into your life. It happened. But if we were to go through your house, it's almost impossible, I would say, for most people to not find some way in which big business was injected, right? Samsung TV, central heating and air, Hollywood DVDs, VHS, laser discs, all your laser discs of Full House. You got the whole season of all the seasons of Full House on your laser disc. What else? On and on and on. You could easily find plenty of things by which big business has injected itself into your life. This is another interesting point that we need to mention into pages 90 through 97 or so is science. Science is not just useful in terms of social engineering and figuring out tricks and techniques for manipulating people, but science is also itself something that needs propaganda. So Bernays was hip to this idea too, that it's not so much that Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye are actual scientists. I mean, what does Bill Nye have? Something like undergraduate degree in engineering, or Tyson's astrophysics degree, or whatever he has. Tyson's always talking about things like evolution and naturalistic materialism, which aren't scientific theories but are philosophies. Meanwhile, he discounts philosophy. But the point I'm getting at is that these are public figures that are there to kind of be pop psyop propagandists for scientism. And Bernays even says this, that science needs marketing to sell its ideas, its philosophy, and ultimately he's talking about scientism. So advertising is directly connected to propaganda, and propaganda is directly connected to advertising. They're kind of a symbiotic force that work together. There were the breakfast wars, and this was altering what a healthy breakfast was, as we saw in the earliest clip. This comes up in the book, or in the clips earlier. Movies, he says, are very crucial, page 187, for amusements and movies. One of the biggest businesses in America, the ballyhoo of show business. And he says that they have learned that theaters aren't as influential anymore, but I'm saying Broadway theaters. Movie theater, however, is still influential. And even if, movie theaters, they're not probably going to die out totally, with Netflix and whatnot. There will always, I would imagine, still be movie theaters of some kind. Because people still enjoy that aesthetic experience of going out to the movies and having the popcorn and whatnot. But movies, he says, can also set trends, and trends can also determine movies. So there's a symbiotic relationship there too. And by extension then, of course, we can see why Pentagon, Hollywood, CIA, etc., why they're so wrapped up in and have been so influential in movies, right? The subject of my book. Politics is business and business is politics. He says the politician is basically the same as the CEO. They're both car salesmen for whatever their principles or ideas are. And he said this back then. He says that what political parties will have to do is master scientific analysis of the public and the group mind in order to sway them. Politics will ultimately be a cult of personality. I think that's pretty much what it has been. Movies, Hollywood, and politics are very similar. He says they're kind of synchronized. And don't discount the power of movies, he says. Like, if you're a politician, you don't want to dismiss Hollywood and theater and music as inconsequential. They have tremendous power to influence public opinion, Bernays says. So you want your political campaign, to have music at the rally, and maybe you want a theme song even for your, you know, like maybe if Donald Trump used Eye of the Tiger or something like that, right? You know, this would be a good example of that. Use a lot of drama and theatrics. Well, Trump's obviously very good at that. Page 121. Drama and theatrics, cause a buzz. Timing, he says, is everything for when you release news stories. For example, something on the weekend might not be as well received as something that you release on Monday morning. This can be very effective when it comes to influencing your target audience or market. He says the presidency in this regard has to master the stage managing technique. And he says that ultimately what's going to happen is that everything will kind of be grouped under a managerial technocracy on page 127. Trained technicians running everything under, quote, science. This rule by experts will be the norm in the future. And they will actually create the drama and the propaganda that the public needs to see, he says on page 128. So that's what we have to expect in Bernays' projection of the manager. And that's the one theme that really runs across all the globalist characters from Quigley to Kessler, Bernays, Russell, Miles Copeland, any of these characters, H.G. Wells. The one theme is technocracy and managerial rule by quote unquote experts. That's what they all say. So really the government, quote unquote, won't be these elected politicians. It won't be these parties in this older system. They all pretty much say that it will, the technocrat goal at least has been to transition things to just rule by expert. Right? Just direct rule by expert, do what you're told. You don't even need any recourse to political process. Political process itself will be dismantled so that, you know, the political process will be data from Star Trek. That's your political process. Data is going to run your life. Next he talks about women's suffrage, feminism, all the alterations of society based on feminism, page 132, 133. 13,000 women's clubs back then. These were all marshaled for the purpose of feminism. And then he kind of basically says, if you really want to have an influence in society and change society, use women. 134 is basically what he's saying there. Women are much easier to manipulate in terms of propaganda and herd think, he says. Freud, I believe, said something similar to that too. And thus, as a result, if you really want to get at society, get to the women, because men are going to be less easily duped by emotional advertising campaigns and that kind of stuff. And so the women will be a lot more susceptible. And once you get the women, they will be able to influence the men because they have the P power. And you know what I mean by the P word, the V word, right? They can have a lot of influence on men because of control over the reproductive desire. So selling science, then, he says, is what Harvard, Yale, and the big institutions were up to at this time in the 20s and 30s. Back in, and what they did was they figured out that, you know, what do you do? Well, you bring in famous people to be hosting museum galas. And museums then obviously play an important role. Obviously, you know, in terms of indoctrinating people into Darwinism, museums have been great for that, as well as the education system. So, how does this scam work? Well, let's have a, night at the museum gala. Not Ben Stiller or Chris Columbus movies, but let's have a night at the museum gala, and we're going to invite, let's see, who's somebody sciencey, that has the appearance of science. smeared all over them. It's not actually. We're going to invite Bill Nye to the museum exhibit tonight. It's going to be a big local community event. Bill Nye is going to stand up there and tell a few jokes about dumb shit that's not funny and pretend like he's a scientist, and he's going to wear a lab coat like he did on his TV show. And we're going to promote what's good to promote tonight. Transhumanism at the local museum, right? The amazing advances in nanotechnology and transhumanism. Bill Nye to speak, or something like this, right? So what I'm saying is that this is how Bernays would say, construct this event. Maybe use a viral marketing campaign, purchase some YouTube video ads, try to start a Twitter hashtag, or I mean, this would be how this would be conducted. And so by creating this buzz, maybe you even stage a little PR scandal where, I don't know what could, Bill Nye tweets something snarky to some preacher, and this becomes like a scandalous buzz about him speaking at a local museum about transhumanism. And so what you've done there is that you've concocted in a dramatic event. You've created a dramatic event through a bunch of theatrics and nonsense, made up stuff, and you sell it, he says, as the public interest. Right? So rebranding things is important for this PR type stuff. So like if your company goes under, you don't want to be Enron, right? That's toxic. That's nobody wants to be associated with the idea of Enron. So we're not ever going to use that name. What you might do then is like rebrand, come back a few years later as the new energy company serving the community, he says. Don't talk about your company as a for-profit institution. Rename it as a service lender, right? As Enron was energy, but energy provider, right? Servicing the community with energy or something like this. So all you've done is just change the name. Maybe it's the same people behind the company have a new name. It's Exron, right? Exron or something like this, servicing the community. And you just sell this new kind of image that you've got. Let's see. He goes on to say, and it's almost like Bernays, as this pseudo-liberal, he's pushing, let's see, he talks about feminism, then he talks about welfare, and then he talks about black civil rights, all of which he sees as these great trends that are going to change society. Now, I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anyone here, but I don't think that Edward Bernay is just supporting feminism, the NAACP, moral quote-unquote campaigns, and then modern art because he really believes in these things. No, he understands that these are alterations of society to lead to the technocracy. And this is why we have the discussion of arts as a weapon. So he says on page 154, just as the arts can uplift society, well, by extension, it stands to reason that they can also degrade society. He says, use a bunch of fancy exhibits. You can do the same thing with art. How do we sell people on degenerate art? Well, let's bring some Lady Gaga, and let's bring Elton John, and let's have them come to an elite artists event. And this guy might not even be an elite artist. He's just some weirdo from the local community college who we've decided to call the great emerging artist. And what does he do? He farts and burns things. He lights his farts and it burns a piece of paper, and the different formations of the burn sections on the paper, he frames it and calls it art. And so we've got Lady Gaga and Elton John there to be at this gala event, or the premiere of fart art. And now everyone is convinced of this because Vice magazine did a piece on it, and who else does this kind of junk? Pitchfork magazine reported on it. Paste magazine reported on it. And whatever other so-called edgy type things that are out there. And then maybe Elton John like plays piano for a little while or something, and Lady Gaga stands on top of the piano in a meat suit and sings. And so this is like now of an event, right? And what this has done is it has degraded the arts while it attempts to kind of give the appearance of some new emerging, really deep artistic trend that you just don't understand because you're not deep enough to get the fart art. And really it's just a creation. And it was amazing as Bernays said. So he actually talks about creating the buzz, right? So page 156, the buzz is crucial to, he says, if you were going to try to sell pianos, he says you can't get anybody at a party to, through word of mouth, talk about the buzz of some piano you're trying to sell. He says what you want to do is get them talking about the modernist piano, because at this period when Bernays was writing, anything, quote, modernist was hot, right? It was a sexy item. Oh, it's modernist, it's modern. Quote, oh, it's very modern. Well, what does that mean? Well, who knows what it means? It just means that, whatever the trendsetters decided to concoct as, quote, modern, right? These Madison Avenue Wall Street guys. So the modernist piano, he says, will have the buzz at the cocktail party. So anyway, this is essentially what the book is. This is the essence of this book, is the science of propaganda, basically just trickery, P.T. Barnum type stuff, right? So again, he says, don't call your bank, the greatest for-profit institution in Gotham City. Title it Gotham's #1 service institution, right? Servicing the community for 80 years. Which, so now it's the bank is basically, the welfare. You know what I mean? The bank is like the greatest blessing that we have in this city. And that's what the science of propaganda can do, right? So hence Bernays renaming the War Department the Defense Department. So that's the essence of this book, and I hope that you've enjoyed the analysis. Not really much more to, it's a small book, so there's not a whole lot more to say about it. It's really pretty straightforward once you think about it. You might think that this is some esoteric science, and definitely a lot of research and R&D goes into the science of advertising marketing. I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but I think it was called social theory, and we dealt with, I don't remember if we did Bernays, but we dealt with a lot of the sociologists out of the University of Chicago and how they discussed mass mind, groupthink, mass advertising. So we had a few classes where we analyzed mass advertising, and that was a very instructive class. I'll never forget that, because I think we watched a movie like Gods Must Be Crazy, and it's been, this was like 12 years ago, so I don't remember everything about the movie, but I think it kind of makes some of these points about advertising and social engineering. And you have the guy in the tribe who finds the Coke bottle and he doesn't really understand what it is, and he might see it as a god, whereas we see it as just this disposable commodity, disposable corn syrup deception. But again, so you could argue, I guess, in ways that Bernays is one of the makers of the modern world. Right? How do we get to the modern world? Well, here's one of those key figures, and whereas somebody like Russell would be a key figure when it comes to maybe geopolitics and quantification and technocracy and that kind of stuff, Bernays is that kind of a key figure when it comes to advertising, marketing, propaganda. So anyway, thank you for listening this week. We may talk Daniel next week, or maybe I'll do Daniel in the middle of the week. I had a lot of requests from people to explain the Daniel article that I wrote, but it's had a lot of views and a lot of readers, and I think that would be a good topic, because the book of Daniel is absolutely amazing. And then, we actually maybe we'll finally get to Dr. John C. Lilly of MKUltra fame and of making Flipper into Tripper by giving dolphins LSD. Thank you for listening. Please tell your friends and family, and look for the new Esoteric Hollywood sequel. Be out in 2018. I don't know when, but soon. I'm working on it now. And thank you all. Love you guys. Merry Christmas.